Welcome to Onto Something. Welcome to another episode of Onto Something. Today on the podcast we have Willem-Paul Nel. Willem-Paul, you're an astrophysicist, right?
Well, undergrad student still.
Yes, so. In the training to become an astrophysicist.
Yeah. I wouldn't call myself an astrophysicist at this stage.
I guess it is one of those things that are, it's quite humbling to study, I believe, because our knowledge and understanding of it is constantly growing and expanding so much.
Yeah, definitely. I think studying something like that, you become very aware of how little you know, and it feels like the further I've studied, the less I feel I know.
Yeah, it's that, what is the Dunning-Kruger effect or whatever they call it?
Yeah.
Like where you think you know stuff and then at some point you realize, you get sort of over a tip and you realize, wow, there's so much more to this than I ever thought there was.
Exactly.
Yeah. And how did you decide on going in that direction? Like what nudged you? Were you always interested in that? Well, let's start actually in the physics space, right? How is that, like the different branches within physics? Where does astrophysics fit in?
Well, physics is kind of split between like theoretical physics and experimental physics, where the theoretical side of things do more calculations, and obviously theoretical physics do experiments, try to confirm whatever the theorists, are hypothesizing or whatever. So astrophysics, I think, is definitely more along the theory side.
Okay, so it's more calculations and not really active experimentation. And
there are obviously a lot of measurements, lots of observations, and also simulations and things like that.
Okay, very cool. And when you say simulations, these are like probably something that's relatively new to the field, right? With the computers and like just the spike in that. Would you say over the last couple of years, those have improved a lot in terms of the sort of calculations that can be performed as computing has improved?
It's definitely become a lot easier, a lot faster, and a lot more can be done in a shorter time. But I think simulations have been around longer than people think, but definitely a lot more has become possible as our capacity for faster computing has increased.
Yeah, that makes sense. It can just fit in more in the same time, basically. And then your specific area of interest, what drew you to it? What made you, were you always interested in physics?
Actually, no. I wasn't that interested in physics. I mean, I was interested in a bunch of things growing up, and but I was more into music. So I tried really hard for a long time pursuing a career in music. Didn't quite work out. And I think somewhere along the line, this is an interesting quirk about me, is I never read much. And I think it was around about 2016, I just decided I want to become a reader. It was this weird decision.
Yeah.
And then I just started reading whatever was around at home. And then I remember around that time, the exclusive books in Mimosa Mall closed down and they sold everything for half price. And I don't know.
So for someone who newly became a reader, that's like a dream come true.
Yeah, so I just looked around. I went to the science section. I think I picked up like 3 books, 2 of them on evolutionary biology and one more along the lines of theoretical physics, relativity, and quantum mechanics. And I read the books and I was instantly, I don't know, there was something that instantly drew me to it. Yeah. And then I just bought every book that I could find on the subject, and I started reading a lot. And I can't remember exactly how old I was at this stage, but this was quite a few years after school. So I didn't go out of school immediately studying because I was doing this whole music thing.
Music. Yeah.
Yeah, trying to make it in the music business. But then I was reading a lot. And then I decided, there was also this shift realizing that a career in music probably is a bit of a stretch. There isn't much of a future in it for me. And yeah, I just decided, even though I'm a bit older, I'd rather try it and fail and say I attempted it rather than living with a regret getting to like 40 or something and realizing that I never attempted it. So, but I also didn't have the correct school subjects. So I had to redo my matric because I picked my school subjects in a certain way because I was extremely lazy. I just wanted to do music.
Just get into music,
Yeah. So I had to redo matric basically. And that was a couple year process. And then basically in 2020, finally started studying.
Yo, that takes a lot of courage, eh? To decide I'm gonna this is what I want to do, no matter what's in front of me or like what people say or how out of depth I'm gonna be in class. I'm gonna throw myself at this completely because this interests me.
Yeah. No, definitely. There was a big thing when my first day on university. I was so nervous because I was around all these people that were on average like 10 years younger than me. And it felt like they were so much smarter because they just came out of high school.
And I didn't fresh and bright-eyed.
Yes.
Yeah.
I remember sitting in calculus class like a week into university. And so, by the way, I didn't redo the entire matric. The school system I worked through allowed me to only redo certain subjects, the ones I needed. And I did have math.
Cool.
But the last time I did math was back in 2012.
Yeah.
So most of it was very fuzzy to me. And I'm sitting there and one of the girls says, "I'm so glad that we're still just busy with high school revision." And I sat there and I was like, what am I doing?
Yeah, like high school was a while ago for me.
Yeah. Everything was new to me because I couldn't remember what happened in school.
Yeah, but I guess what helps in that context, even though you're a bit like you can't remember the actual technical aspects of it, I think the maturity helps a bit when you're studying, because if you just come fresh out of school and you get a bad mark, you think this is the end of the world. While someone who's lived a bit more and has more experience, you take those things in your stride and you look to the next one and you decide, I'm just going to smash that. So I don't know whether you experience the same thing, that the maturity actually helps you during your studies.
Oh, definitely. Because in the beginning, there definitely was... I was struggling quite a bit. I remember my first physics semester test getting like 30%. And I remember speaking to my dad and I told him, I think I'm going to take way more time with this degree and that is allotted. And then obviously a pandemic happened. We were all sent home for a while. And then there was about 5 weeks that the university was shut down. And then I kind of had this shock of what university was like. And I spent those 5 weeks just preparing myself for when university was finally going to continue. Just sat with textbooks doing problems.
But it seems like you're very comfortable in the self-learning environment, like actually just without someone guiding you, just sitting with the material and sort of absorbing it and working through it and making it your own.
Yeah, I did for a big part of my education. I was homeschooled, but I was a very bad student. My parents weren't very strict. So I finished with school probably like 3 years later than I should have. But at the same time, I was also doing music full time. So school was kind of like a
side quest.
Yes, an afterthought. And so I would say at that stage, it wasn't like that. But I'm someone that's extremely curious. And when I'm curious about something, I can spend a lot of time on that thing.
Yeah, then time flies when you immerse yourself in that material and it doesn't feel like work anymore.
Exactly. And I'm lucky to be studying something that I'm extremely curious about.
That's what I wanted to ask. When you started you read this book now and now you started studying, was it what you expected? You still enjoying it? How are you finding that?
In a sense, it was what I was expecting, and in a different sense, I think also a lot more difficult than I was expecting. I don't know. I would say it was definitely something I had to adjust to very quickly, because it's one thing to read a bunch of, like, as they call it, pop science books that have all these interesting
fun facts almost.
And some of them go into quite a bit of detail about theories, but all the math is ripped out.
Yeah.
And then you sit there in class and it's almost exclusively math, then you have 5 subjects that are all, it feels like, math modules.
That is insane. And I mean, does that continue straight throughout the studies, or are you not sure yet? For example, if you do your postgrad, is it always math heavy, or at some point does it become lighter on the math?
I'm actually not sure about that. Yeah, we'll see when we get there.
Yes.
But I know there are definitely a bunch of things that we have to learn how the math works and have to be able to do the math that in reality or in practice gets done by computers.
Yeah, I mean that's always the case, right? Yeah. For some reason they just still hammer those things into our heads. So sometimes, I mean, I had a lecturer or two who had a bit more foresight, and they were like, "I'm not going to let you learn proofs and like that kind of thing, because it's just it's nonsensical to a large degree, because it's not something that you ever going to use necessarily, and it just takes up a lot of time." And rather learning like, how do we use these computer systems that you're actually going to use in the workplace and when you actually start working on this.
Yeah, definitely.
Which I think that's a great insight, actually. I think it's the better way to go about it. But the other thing I wanted to ask you, your background was in music.
Yes.
Then you went into the physics. And Viedi and I actually discussed it in our first episode, is there's links between the two in terms of waves and the way that you can use sound within the physics environment, if I'm not mistaken. Has your background helped you at all? Well, probably not with your studies up to this point, but is there some overlap or?
There is actually a surprising amount of overlap and certain concepts that I understood from music, and I also had my own studio back in the day, and spent hours learning, theory of sound and waves and stuff like that. And it mostly carried over, especially last year in the physics practicals that we did, concepts like wavelengths and frequencies and harmonics and all those kinds of things. As a musician, I knew those terms, and musicians kind of think those are musical terms, but it is just terms generally about waves.
So you even use the word harmonics in physics?
Oh yes, definitely.
That isn't. I mean, I didn't even know that. So what would harmonics refer to? Like,
I mean, it's basically like you've got, say, a fundamental frequency, and then you'll have a third or a fifth, and it just it refers to the relationship of different waves to each other and how they constructively and destructively interfere and things like that.
That is fascinating. Yeah.
That obviously applies straight into music.
Yeah.
And I remember I somewhere last year I was having coffee with a friend, and he asked me about some of my studies, and I was just talking about the physics practical that I had just done. And then he's like, "But why are you doing so much like music related stuff?" And I'm like, actually, it had nothing to do with music. It was just waves.
Yeah.
And yeah, obviously with music, you're working with sound waves. And so the same, I guess, language gets used.
Exactly. And I mean, something that I do believe in, and sort of almost the premise of this podcast as well, is that life takes you down weird twists and turns, but it prepares you for, if you follow your gut and you follow your intuition, it takes you where you need to go. So, I mean, you going through this whole journey of music and then ending up in physics, it could potentially lead to something very, very cool, with you thinking about all of these concepts in a way that's not maybe not common for the average physicist, if that makes sense.
Yeah, quite possibly.
Yeah, I mean, if you look around you, you probably think about these things a lot different from most of the fresh high schoolers in your class.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a level of, I don't know if maturity is the correct word, that comes from the experience that you've had previously in life and the things you learn, carrying it over into a new field like physics.
Yeah. And within physics, is there, I mean, now you said you in your second year now?
Actually, final year.
Final year now.
Yeah. So.
And is there anything that you like? What's the process from here when you do honors? Do you need to do it in a specific field, or how does it work from here? And is there anything that has caught your eye?
Well, that's actually quite difficult. Yeah, and so in honors you kind of have to specialize. So my degree up to this point is in physics and astrophysics, and in honors you kind of have to choose your lane, I think. Yeah, so, and that's actually a difficult decision for me, because deciding to study astrophysics that in itself was a hard decision, because the whole, everything in physics to me is very interesting, and it still is. And I'm at this point now where I realize I have to choose now, but I'm not quite sure in which direction. Do I want to go into astrophysics or more like the experimental side of physics? Because I'm very interested in electronics and microprocessors and how things, devices like that.
You just sound like you have a very wide range of interest. I can understand why you and Vidya are friends.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, I feel like sometimes it's a problem. If you're very focused on one thing and interested in one thing, it's easy to, I think, stay focused. And I can sometimes drift off between these wide ranges of interests I have.
Yeah.
So I haven't quite decided. There's a part of me that really wants to stay in astrophysics. There's a lot of interesting research happening there, and it's just, it's interesting. It's kind of a field of physics that really is satisfying in a way that, like, it's exploring our place in the universe.
Yeah.
But also more things like solid state physics and quantum mechanics, and the world of the very small is also, such a interesting part of physics. And it's also a part of physics that it's a part of physics that, in a sense, we know a lot about. Like, we can leverage it to do a bunch of things, like microprocessors and CAT scans and MRI scans, and all these things have benefited from that side of physics. It's improved our lives a lot, but it's, when it comes to what is really going on, there's still very big gaps in our understanding of, that world. So
yeah, and you said something that I think resonates with me as well, is that we study these concepts and we look at it because we want to make sense of ourselves and where we fit in this whole picture. Do you find some of that in your studies as well? Like, do you feel like it helps you make sense and navigate this crazy world to a better degree if you can understand some of these concepts?
I can't say that it really does, but yeah, sometimes I just sit and ponder about, the magnitude of the universe, and there is kind of a feeling that I get from when I look at how massive and old the world is, and our position in it, how short we are on this earth,
Yeah, it's like nothing, basically.
Yeah, to me it's quite a empowering feeling in a weird sense,
Why empowering?
I don't know. It's, for me, it's almost like, I don't know if empowering is the right word, but in a I think like the universe in a sense almost doesn't care about us, and we can often get so obsessed about our problems and what's going on in the world and stuff. And if you stand back for a moment, you're like, we're such a small part of what's going on.
It's freeing almost. Like, our insignificance is what makes this special to a degree. Like, you can do what
I guess freeing is the correct word. You
can live your life however way you want to. But on the other hand, again, everything that you do have far-reaching and like the classic like butterfly effect that is always referred to. So I guess you sort of have both sides of the coin. Like, nothing you do matters, and on the other side, everything you do matters.
Yeah.
that kind of, the universe doesn't care at all, but everything around you react to what you do and your decisions and choices.
Yeah, definitely. I think to put it in another way, it's like we can often become so obsessed about things that don't really add any value to our lives, and obsess about, situations and things in a certain sense. And it's sometimes just good to stand back and it's like, what is this adding to my life, and yeah, if that makes sense.
Just look at things a bit objectively and like assess things in that way. In terms of interest in math and that part of science, I suppose, where you said you weren't interested in that at school. You had math at school, but you wanted to go into music, right?
Yeah.
And then did your interest in math start with you starting to read as well, or how did that happen?
So what's interesting, in school, math was always my favorite subject. And when choosing my subject in high school, even though I chose the easiest subjects, I still chose proper math but I think that was also a bit of an ego thing. I was like, math literacy is for stupid people. But I was also at the same time not great at math, but I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. I feel like sometimes people just, they enjoy things because they're good at it. I always enjoyed math and it was interesting to me.
But I think that's a function of modern society as well. Like, you're not allowed to just enjoy something for the enjoyment of it. You either have to like impress with it, or you have to generate income out of it. There's not this pursuit of just pleasure with doing things.
And math is a interesting one to just like be casually interested in. I don't know how common it is. I think it's actually more common than people think, because there's this one guy that has a bunch of YouTube channels. He's based at the University of Nottingham. I don't know if you've heard of any of them, but Numberphile, Computerphile.
Yeah, I've watched some Numberphile videos.
Yeah, so I think he's got like 9 YouTube channels on different, on physics, on astrophysics, on chemistry, everything. But the math channel is actually the most popular one.
Yeah.
Most subscribers, most video views. So that's interesting. I think more people enjoy math than we think. But I wasn't great at math. And when I was finishing school, I kind of did it in a rush. I was homeschooling at that stage. And I wasn't really taking anything in. And so I didn't have a good foundation. So it kind of gaining the interest in physics, I think the interest in math was kind of like rekindled.
Yeah.
Because I knew it was going to be a massive part of it. Because physics is kind of just like an applied math degree, really.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where it came from. And I think last year at one stage, I think my mom was at the Boeremark, and the guy who was tutoring me when I was finishing school, she got him there, and he asked, "Oh, what's Willem-Paul doing currently?" She's like, "Oh no, he's studying astrophysics." And he's like, "No,
taken aback.
No, you're joking," because I really wasn't that great at math. So even my dad says he never really saw me as being someone that would go into any form of science, really.
But I think that speaks to just will and enjoyment as well. I think in many instances, having a passion and enjoyment for something trumps innate ability for that. Because as you said earlier, you can spend those hours and you can throw in that effort behind it. Like, I always pity the people, like my heart breaks for the people who study something that they hate. I think it's okay to study something, but it's not really your passion, and that's manageable. But studying something that you have zero interest in whatsoever, I think it's a nightmare, because now you have to force your entire being into taking in this material that's just not for you. So you're the opposite example of that, basically, where the math was not necessarily an innate ability, but it's something that you just really enjoy doing, and so it came easy after a while.
Yeah, and still up until this point, I'm not very quick with math, and like some people can do like very quick mental arithmetic and just the basic stuff you do at school. They're very quick with that. I'm actually not very quick with stuff like that. My astrophysics final exam that I wrote last year, I think I left like a third of the test just open, just because I'm not very quick.
Yeah.
By the end. So, and it's still something I kind of struggle with, just because of my general slowness with math, I would say, but I still enjoy it a lot. And I want to say it's like kind of like the weakness in all of like, which is of all my academic abilities, which is not the best to have when you're studying what I study, but I mean, I've improved obviously a lot because I spend a lot of time with it and, try to get better. Yeah, but for me, it's pure enjoyment, and I don't think I've got much of innate ability, really.
I'm always quite astounded as well by the number of. I feel there's a disproportionate amount of children of teachers who have strong math ability, and I think that speaks to the nurture over nature almost with these sorts of things. Like, if you know how to present a subject in a manner that is interesting or fun or engaging, where obviously a mother has or a father has some vested interest with their own children, that just increases the probability of the kids being interested and becoming good at that subject specifically. Which again is basically the scenario that your parents, what are they in scientific fields or?
No, not at all. So I grew up in Bloemfontein on the military base, actually, on the Tempe military base for like the first, I think, 11 years of my life or something like that, 10 years of my life, I can't remember. I stayed there. My dad was in the army. And my mom was a pet food rep. And then they got a contract with the pet food company, and my dad left the army and then pretty much went into logistics, distributing pet food. Okay. And there was a big part of my life between the kind of like being involved in music and stuff that I worked for my parents for an income. Yeah. And that was also interesting. I spent hours on the road delivering dog food to like every town in the Free State, just listening to podcasts. And that's actually a part that I completely forgot about, but that along with the reading is something that, kind of kindled the interest in science and math. And I mean, initially starting with the podcasts, I listened to podcasts on music and music production, and then there was like this slow shift. But I probably had 10 to 15 hours a week that I spent listening to podcasts just because I'm on the road alone.
Yeah, it's a cool new media that can help people who maybe aren't into reading, because some people just dislike reading.
I was that person.
Exactly, but the opposite also happens sometimes. You have people who read everything they can find while they're kids, and then once they grow up, they don't touch a book again in their entire lives because it's sort of lost its appeal to them. No. So I think that you're on the better side of that deal, to be honest.
Yeah, but I mean, at the same time, as you said, like with podcasts, like not everyone likes reading, and I think there's a lot of ways to consume information that isn't necessarily reading. But I think reading has got it's a unique experience that it forces you to be engaged in a subject that, like, I'm a little bit ADD, so I struggle to concentrate, and I feel like reading is the best way for me to consume something because it forces me to be engaged. You can't do it while doing something else.
You're just there. It's just you and the book, and that's it basically. And I mean, in terms of the differences, you say now looking at the universe, astrophysics, right? As opposed to astronomy. What is it a branch? Is it a different field? What is the difference between the two?
This is fascinating. I think about like a year into my studies, I went to Google this because I was like, some people talk about astrophysics and some people talk about astronomy. What really is the difference? And I think the answer to that, I don't know if there is someone that will disagree with me, but it's really the same thing. I mean, physics is so part of astronomy. And I read something that one professor that's been in the field for like 30 years wrote, and he says usually if someone insists on the term astrophysicist, there's like an ego attached to it. Like it sounds
cool. It sounds very overwhelming and impressive.
But it really is astronomy, astrophysics. I don't know, at least to me, it's the same thing.
Yeah, so the overlap would be so close that it's nearly indistinguishable.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same thing. I mean, you can't, if you go back in history, people always had this concept of things on Earth had one set of rules, things in the heavens had a different set of rules, and often astronomy was very influenced by, I want to say, a more theological way of thinking.
Yeah.
And some philosophers would almost divorce physics from it. And then it was this process of more and more physics being used to explain what's going on in the world, to whereas we are today, it's all physics, really.
Like with the scientific enlightenment and people actually understanding and that the same rules that apply here also applies there.
Yeah.
There's just a bizarre place to be. Because, I mean, there are bizarre things out there, right?
Yeah.
Like, what are some of the... in terms of... I mean, it's almost those fun facts that you read in the book sometimes. What are some of the things that you've encountered now in your studies that's just like, this is pretty whack that it exists out there in this wild universe?
I mean, for me, black holes is a pretty... it's something everyone knows about the existence of black holes, but it's a really bizarre object that has a lot of mass, but is infinitely small.
I wanted to say, like, black holes as a concept is just over my head, right? So it has a lot of mass, but it's infinitely small.
Yeah, so it's... I hope I'm not making any mistakes here, but
no, but I mean that's part of the journey as well as learning.
So it's something that came out of Einstein's math when he was working on general relativity, or I think maybe after he'd already published his main theory on general relativity, where he kept encountering these like singularities. And even Einstein initially was like, no, these are just like quirks of math. And
with singularities?
A point that's infinitely small.
Okay.
Yeah. And, even he was, he initially thought, it's quirks of the math. These objects don't really exist in the world. And then there was a while where some people thought they did exist, maybe, and other people didn't think they exist, but we had no way of seeing them. But it was like a while for the theory to, catch up, where people figured out, like, what are we looking for? What are we actually going to see? And I think that's Stephen Hawking, obviously very famous physicist. That's a big part of the work he did. If I'm not mistaken, I think Roger Penrose.
So I just want to stop you. So initially they had these things in the math, showed up in the math, and they were like, this is probably like something that is in the math but not observable out there. And then after a while, but they didn't know what to look for even out there. Like, how would these things manifest themselves in the universe?
So the thing is, the part of black holes that I feel like most people have heard of is that they're so dense and the mass is so concentrated that light itself cannot escape it.
That's the classic. I mean, that's from the movies. As
yeah.
when there's a black hole opening somewhere, you just hear someone like, light itself can't even escape a black hole.
Yeah. So, but what's interesting is they found that there are certain things we maybe will be able to observe. And what's interesting is objects around black holes, as they get sucked into a black hole. And just to clarify, there's always this misconception that a black hole is this thing and everything that comes close just gets sucked in. But a black hole of a certain mass will be exactly like any other thing of that mass. So for instance, if you replace the sun with a black hole with the same mass of the sun, everything will go on as if nothing happened.
Okay.
The planets wouldn't get sucked in or anything. They would continue orbiting this mass, a black hole, because it has the same mass.
But it's just if some black holes have massive mass.
Yes, obviously. You get what they call supermassive black holes. Very creative, which they theorize, which they now think are at the center of all spiral galaxies, such as the Milky Way. A couple years ago, they were able to, in a sense, take a photo, but it's not a normal photo in our visible spectrum that as we're used to. But obviously, they published it in this way where people can kind of like see this object in our visible wavelengths.
I remember that actually.
Yeah, and that was the black hole at the center of our galaxy. But they're really fascinating and weird objects. It's interesting.
So I mean, we don't. So you say they're infinitely small.
Yeah.
With this massive mass, right?
Yeah, it kind of breaks your brain.
Exactly, it 100% breaks your brain, and we have no concept for what happens with anything that gets sucked into that black hole. Like, what does being sucked into a black hole mean?
So a black hole it's not a thing, but there is kind of like this perimeter around it that they call the event horizon. That's not part of the black hole, but it's like once you go beyond that point, you're never coming back out. But when you're outside the event horizon, you're safe.
Okay.
But when you get pulled in, there's what they call the spaghettification, is the mass between the different parts of your body will be so vastly different that you kind of be ripped apart or pulled into this, I guess, piece of spaghetti.
Just strung out, basically.
It's a very hand-wavy way of explaining it.
Yeah.
Also, interesting thing about getting sucked in is they say the closer you get to the black hole, because of its mass, someone observing you getting sucked in, this is one of the consequences of general relativity, is time will slow down for someone watching you. And I think there's certain parts of the world, I can't remember where they talk about frozen stars, where time slows down, but only from someone else's perspective. Sorry, observing you.
When you say certain parts of the world, what do you mean by that?
I like certain countries.
Okay.
Yeah. I've heard that they talk about frozen stars, and what that kind of implies is someone will kind of infinitely into the future, in a sense, be able to observe you falling into the black hole because of this phenomenon that they call time dilation.
See, that whole sentence, there's just nothing for me there. So you being sucked into this black hole, right? It has a massive mass.
Yeah.
When something gets sucked into the black hole, is that mass, is it an addition to that mass? If that makes sense. So suppose a black hole weighs something and another object weighs...
Yes. I would assume so. Obviously, this is a part of the conversation. This is something I've never thought of. But I would assume, the mass gets added to the mass of the black hole.
Yeah, so anything it sucks in gets added to that.
Yeah.
That is a terrifying concept. No wonder in space movies, it's the ultimate scary thing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the one thing that you do not want to encounter in your life.
Those are some of the most bizarre objects, I think, in the universe that I find fascinating. But it's obviously...
The sentence that you... Sort of just getting back to the one that broke my brain is... You will be continuously... Sorry, what was the exact word?
Yeah, continuously falling into the black hole.
From another observer's perspective.
Yeah. Because
of time dilation, it slowed down for them, so you just do your thing forever.
Yeah. So just to kind of explain what that means, in relativity, there's this phenomenon that they call time dilation that gets affected by gravity and the speed at which you're traveling. So if, say, I am traveling very quick with respect to you, you will think time has slowed down for me, and I will think time has slowed down for you. And it's this really weird thing to think about.
Wait, so will you also think it has slowed down for me?
Yeah, it goes both ways.
Okay.
And it gets affected by motion, but also by gravity. And the first theory that was published by Einstein in 1905 was on special relativity. And what that meant, it was only in a special, like in a special case. And he ignored gravity. And then he kind of worked for the next 10 years trying to incorporate gravity.
Okay,
and then
into the math, basically.
Yes, and then he published some papers in 1915 on general relativity. And it sounds like really weird and out there, but the practical uses for it is those time differences has to be incorporated into things like satellites and GPS, because without that, you won't be able to accurately travel somewhere. But once you start thinking about the really like more theoretical stuff, what would happen, say, if someone falls into a black hole, it becomes really weird and very strange to think about. Like time almost becomes infinite for the person observing you, but not for the person in that situation. He'll just like fall in and be gone.
Time is a concept that we deal with every day, obviously. Like, I'll meet you there at 9 or 5 minutes has passed. So it's something... But it's something that we don't think of being flexible and being able to manipulate in any manner.
Yeah.
While once you go into that realm of physics, you realize this is not the truth anymore. We know. I think for most people would recognize that brain time is also differs from person to person. It's very subjective. Like an hour waiting for terrible news feels like a year, but an hour playing a video game feels like a second. But the idea that actual measurable time changes and is able to be manipulated, that's basically what you're saying now.
Yes.
Right? And that's something that's just, I think, bizarre to 95% of the population.
Just to clarify, we can't actually manipulate it. Passing of time, but it definitely isn't fixed as we think it is.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting. We have a very good intuition for physics of the everyday, the stuff we encounter. You don't really think about this, but someone throws you a ball, assuming you've got
ball sense.
Decent ball sense. You catch the ball. Your brain was doing a calculation about the trajectory of the ball. Without you don't think about that, but your brain is kind of predicting where the ball's going to go, and then you catch it.
The craziest thing is how you can even do that, like catch it behind your head. Like when you... So what that means... Well, to my mind, what that means is you did all the calculations until where you could observe the ball, and then from there you had to basically extrapolate. Like, I observed this arc, expecting that same sort of speed and trajectory. Where do I expect to catch it? And then you can catch something behind you, without seeing it, right?
Yes, yeah.
And that's a lot of calculations that's happening there. And
it really is.
Our brains are good at that.
It's fascinating to look at robotics and the progression of robotics. And a lot of work in robotics, they're just trying to simulate what we as humans do normally, and the amount of math and calculations that go into that is mental. And just to think our brains just do it normally
while breathing and wanting to eat and having all of these other systems going.
And oftentimes you hear about some creature or something being able to sense wavelengths we can't see, and then you're like, wow, that's so fascinating that they can work like that. But just thinking about humans and our capacity for doing physics calculations is really fascinating. But it's something that kind of we understand our everyday world very well.
It doesn't seem strange. It's sort of unrelated, but I think you'd appreciate the sentiment. But I always tell people it's quite bizarre when you think about just sound and talking, like language. I've got these films in my throat that vibrate, that vibrates the air, that sort of hits your ear, and then gets translated into a like impulse that your brain can make sense of. If you had, to us humans now, it seems, as you say, it's the physics of the everyday life. So to us, it's like, oh yeah, I'm talking and I'm hearing someone.
Yeah.
But if you had to look at that as like objective, like a creature that does not understand this, it's a bizarre way of communication, or like it's just a bizarre concept in general. So I guess with time, and I mean that's what you're doing now.
Yeah.
You try to make sense of these non-everyday physics concepts.
Yeah. So once you get to, the physics of the really large or moving at what they call relativistic speeds, so a significant fraction of the speed of light, kind of things work in a way that we don't understand, or we don't have.
It's not intuitive.
It's not intuitive because it's not part of our everyday life, because you don't travel from here to Joburg at a significant portion.
Yeah, you should see my car, bro. Like that thing moves sometimes.
But I mean, even if you're going at 300 kilometers an hour, that's kind of insignificant in, when compared to the speed of light. So it's just not part of how our intuition of the world is. So it's fascinating, and it's interesting to like that the world is so bizarre, but there are some really interesting applications, for instance, like, things like GPS and stuff. And without understanding these phenomena, we wouldn't have had that. But it's just not, I want to say it almost like feels separate from our world because we don't experience
it. We don't deal with it every day. Like
exactly.
You're used to catching balls, you're used to these sort of everyday things, but concepts like that. I mean, back to your, I remember at some point I wanted to just, I'm also quite curious about many subjects, so I wanted to see, can I make sense of relativity at all? And the thing that I encountered was the moving trolley with the two mirrors on them. I mean, that's probably the most basic example. And that kind of made sense to me. And then there was like, then they went into a bit more detail, and that was just like, okay, no, there's nothing for me here anymore. Like this is going to take some time to make sense of.
I remember the first time I encountered it, it was really weird for me. And then you go through these stages where you're like, yeah, I think I understand now. And then like the next example or the next thing comes and you're like, whoa, wait.
that just breaks everything again.
Yes. I thought I understood, but I don't at all. And doing, math related to relativity is interesting because you have to keep in mind what's happening in what reference frames, and say you've got two observers, one on Earth, one in a spaceship traveling at a significant portion of light. You have to keep in mind the whole time, like, this guy is going to experience this or see this guy doing this, and this guy
it is absolutely bizarre, and it's definitely not an easy way of thinking. I guess a lot of your training goes into that sort of frame of mind and like becoming more comfortable with thinking about those differences and those interactions. And
going to the world of the super small things are just way more bizarre than that, quantum mechanics, but that's something that doesn't really get covered in undergrad physics until later. I know we're going to do some of it this year, but I think we're going to barely scratch the surface. But really getting into that and the math of that is something that happens much later. And yeah, it's really interesting that, we kind of live in, I want to say, this medium place between the very large and the very small, and we only understand what's going on around us, but the universe is so much more vast in going, zooming out or zooming in.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's, what was the quote exactly? I think it's like every drop contains an ocean or something similar to that. I mean, it depends on what your perspective is and where you stand in this whole thing.
Yeah.
But the very small, you spoke about like quantum mechanics and physics and that kind of thing, right? When you go into like that, the tiny aspect of things, I think that, as you say, that's even more bizarre than it's easier for us to blow things up than to imagine this tiny thing is has the possibility to be a blown up thing if you can be small enough and to observe it in that way. What have you touched on there, and what's...
I mean, from that world, all I know so far is what I've kind of read in
your own
pop science, I guess, and the documentaries I've watched and books I've read, but it's not something I've touched on in
your formal education.
In my formal education. So, but it is a very interesting world that has given the world, I mean, out of our understanding of the very small, we have iPhones, and computers, and whole range of medical devices and nuclear power and all those kinds of things. So it's, what I will say was very interesting to me. I heard a physicist speaking about it once, and he said physicists understand quantum mechanics and the world of the small, kind of like an iPhone user understands his iPhone. He knows how to do a bunch of stuff with his iPhone, but ask him how do the transistors in the processor works, and he's kind of lost.
I used to go down that route quite often, like where I would sit and realize, okay, I would sit and I would look at the TV and I'm like, how does this thing work?
Yeah.
But then my usual go-to argument next was, I'm not even entirely sure how a toilet flush works. Like I'm not entirely convinced I understand the physics or the mechanics that goes into a toilet. And if I can't understand a toilet, there's no way for me to understand a TV.
Yeah.
But then weirdly enough, there's like a Coursera or there's some weird course on understanding fluid mechanics of toilets specifically, and I actually did that. So now I've got toilets down to a decent understanding. So maybe next I can start looking at some of the more complex things out there,
like a TV.
Yeah, I think TV is still one too far. Hey.
Yeah.
But as you said, now there's so many things that we just don't understand. But our knowledge is growing at a rapid pace.
No, definitely.
And I don't think we'll ever. I mean, what would 100% understanding constitute? I don't think that's a reasonable goal. Or do you think we'll reach a point where you're like, okay, we now know enough, if that makes sense?
Yeah. I kind of doubt it. I think there's just, the universe is too vast and we're too small. I don't think we'll 100% understand anything ever. Well, we won't understand everything at a point where we're like, we know exactly how this works. What's fascinating is about the end of, I think, like the 1900s, physics was at a stage where they're like, okay, we kind of figured everything out. And
Let's chill a bit.
Yeah, and we just need to, from this point, we are going to make more exact measurements, but we kind of understand everything. And then, Einstein came along and a whole
nope.
Yes, and a whole bunch of other people, and the quantum revolution happened and relativity, and then just everyone's concept of the world broke, and it was like, okay, we don't understand the world.
So I mean, I guess from that perspective, I guess that's what drives a lot of people as well, is being the next driver of a breakthrough of similar magnitude, like being able to shift the way that we understand the way the universe works and manifests itself at such a fundamental level.
I think there's a degree, I don't know if it will ever happen in the same way again, because our body of knowledge has grown to such a point that no one can know, I want to say, everything. There was a time where if you're a physicist, you know all of
physics.
You knew all of physics.
Yeah.
And I think it's there's a book, I think it's a biography of a physicist named Enrico Fermi that's called The Last Man Who Knew Everything. Because
that's a fascinating concept.
Yeah, because there was this, physicists knew all of physics, but then it grew at such a rapid pace into the era of what we call modern physics that people had to specialize, and you have to know a lot about this area of physics. You can't know everything anymore, and I think for that reason, either big shifts in our understanding won't be a single person like Isaac Newton or Einstein. It will be massive teams of people, or it will be smaller increments.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And just on that, becoming like a specialist, or for your progression forwards, would you prefer, because based on your personality and what I've been able to observe now, it seems like you like playing the whole field. Would you want to go and focus on one specific thing, or do you think you'd always prefer like having a broad knowledge of everything, like a light understanding of everything?
I think I would always enjoy having a light understanding of everything, but obviously you're forced to specialize, especially if you want a career.
in the modern, in the modern way that things are set up.
So, as I say, I don't quite know where my speciality would be or in what I would specialize, but I think you're kind of forced to, in a sense.
Yeah, to pick something and then just go all out on that.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I think we've covered a lot of sort of the astrophysics side of things, and your degree and like sort of your official interests. So I'd like to explore your side quests and maybe start with your background in music. I mean, you're in your Iron Maiden t-shirt, so I assume that the band you were in was a heavier genre of music. What did you pursue there, and like how did that come about? Was it your high school band, or how did it play out?
So interestingly enough, I never played in metal bands for the majority of my life.
No ways.
Yes. I had this thing where I was a massive fan of metal music. None of my friends were really, and I didn't find the whole subculture very appealing. So because I feel like metal is very much a style where there's this whole subculture. Not that it's bad, I just wasn't into it.
It's just not you.
It wasn't me.
Yeah.
And so I played, all kinds of, I kind of grew up in the church, playing in the church band, played a bunch of corporate jazz gigs, that kind of thing. And then just, I don't know, I played a variety of music, a lot of Afrikaans music as well.
See, that's so surprising to me. I would not have guessed that based on the t-shirt.
Yeah, but I mean, there was a lot of time when I'm on my own, putting on headphones, jamming along to Iron Maiden tunes or, just metal tunes, and I really enjoyed it. So I feel like it was the genre I was actually the best in, just because it was but it was also always like a personal thing for me. It was never something I did in a band.
Yeah, explored with others.
Yeah, and then I think, I can't remember how old I was, but some mutual friends of Vieda and I, we kind of got together with another friend of mine that's, my best friend, but he was never really into metal. And then, this friend of ours, Ezra, there was this gig coming up. They were looking for opening bands. And I think it was 3 weeks away or something. And he was just like, guys, let's put a band together. And he told the people organizing the gig, okay, we're in. And so
we have a band.
We have a band. And all of a sudden we had this metal band, no songs. And then we spent a couple of weeks writing songs and rehearsing for, I think it was for an Italian punk band.
That's such a bizarre story, right?
Yeah. And then, we actually then played quite a few gigs just in the Bloemfontein local scene, and it was a lot of fun. And then that band kind of fizzled out, ended.
Burned bright and quick and then fizzled out. I mean, I suppose just on the creative process, I think I actually read an article, weirdly enough, last week on the writing of Metallica's Sad But True.
Okay.
I think it's Metallica, Sad But True.
Yeah, it is Metallica.
And they sort of spoke about how that creative process works for each band, right? And what they said here specifically is basically it started with the lead singer. Again, I'm not that clued up, I just read this. But he was literally one night alone at home, jamming with his guitar, similarly to what you just said, and then they recognized. I mean, there's a drum machine in the back, so there's some noise to it, but they could immediately recognize there's value to this noise. Basically, it's not a song yet, but we can work with this. While I feel like the process that you were forced in was very much like, in 3 weeks we have to have songs. Yeah. So like you didn't really allow yourself that organic growth of the band to happen in the creative process.
No, we didn't. We kind of had like, I think we only had 4 songs with our first show. I can't really remember. And I think the majority of it was almost like we were just like writing together in a room, coming up with ideas. I remember Ezra, who was playing guitar in the band, he would come with riffs and we'd all kind of like just jam along to the riffs, see what comes up, and then people chucked out ideas. But that band, I think it lasted for like a year or 2. And then when that ended, then kind of, I think, people saw us play and stuff. And there was another metal band in Bloem whose drummer moved to a different town.
So what did you play?
Drums.
Okay, so you were on the drums.
I was on the drums, yes. And their drummer had just moved, and they were looking for another drummer. So I joined the band, and I ended up playing metal for like another year. And it was a lot of fun. I have to say, one of the things I really enjoy about playing metal is, as I say, there's this whole subculture around it. And that means like people come to the shows and they're almost like fans, where if you play Afrikaans music, it's almost like people come for the enjoyment and stuff, and then maybe they become fans later. But metal is just like people come, they're immersed in the music. You start jamming, mosh pits form, and it's almost like this participation of the crowd, which is a lot of fun.
So you really, because you, from what I've observed now, you seem to be quite introverted.
I am.
But you enjoyed that stage and like rocking it up there. That is quite
definitely a lot of fun.
Opposite from what you'd expect from someone. But did you like the attention, or did you just like giving this to the crowd? Like, what would you say was the appeal of playing?
I think there was this aspect for me of, it's not just music and a bunch of people sitting there staring at you. I feel like the participation of the audience makes it more fun, and then you see people enjoying it, and it gives you more energy. What's interesting, I always say like the 2 most fun gigs I've ever had was playing in a dance band at a wedding, and there was a specific gig we had with this one band that was just a great night, and both of it is for the same reason. Like the dance band, people aren't just sitting there staring at you. They're really participating in the music,
as you do at weddings.
As you do at weddings, dancing, and it's different than metal music, but both I almost get the same amount of enjoyment from.
That is very interesting. Okay, so then you played for the second metal band,
and that lasted about a year, and then the one guitarist, the lead guitarist, moved away again, and also just kind of fizzled out.
I think that's a problem from what I've observed with bands, is all of these vagrants. Like people come, they play for a bit, and then there's just something that baits them away. But I guess that's also because oftentimes you'd hear stories about some of the great bands, and they'd be good, and then like one person would have to move away, and they'd get a new guitarist in, and then they blow up all of a sudden. And you feel so bad for that guy that was in the band like a month ago, but decided to... I remember there was a guy on Would I Lie to You who was in the Beatles, like not long before they became massive. Because, I mean, obviously all bands need to work their way up. So this guy was like in the Beatles, and then at some point he just had to... They weren't big, and so he moved out. And then a month or 2 later, suddenly they were the Beatles. They were massive.
Yeah. I remember I read a story in the Modern Drummer, drumming magazine, about about Ringo Starr and a lot of his iconic pieces. And he didn't play on the first Beatles album because he was a new member, and the producer didn't trust him quite enough yet to be tracking in the studio, because back then we didn't have the luxuries of Pro Tools and things like that to edit stuff. And it's very interesting. So
didn't they have a drummer, or did they have someone else playing for them?
They got a session guy, but Ringo was already part of the band.
But he just had to watch.
He just had to watch someone else play.
The poor guy, it reminds me of that. I don't know whether you've seen that meme or quote or whatever, where they Paul was the heart of the band, John was the soul of the band, and then George was the spirit of the band, and Ringo was the drummer of the band. I don't know whether you've ever seen that. They give the poor guy a lot of shit there. But I mean, even now the guy's going strong, hey?
Yeah, and I think, isn't he quite old?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Exactly.
But he's still got his band that he's doing.
I think if it's in you, it's something. Do you still play drums?
I do. There was a stage after the metal band where I don't know. I kind of got frustrated with the way I had this thing that I pursued in music that didn't quite work out in the way that I had imagined that it would. I spent some time giving drum lessons because that's how a lot of people in music make a living, is from giving lessons, and that just wasn't for me. And the ironic thing is I really enjoyed teaching, but explaining to a kid why he has to do this really mundane exercises for a couple of hours just so he can play his favorite song is kind of I don't know.
I think it's fine if the kid wants to be there, but I think oftentimes it's also parents trying to okay, you have to play an instrument, and then they force them in there. And I can't imagine it's fun teaching a kid anything
that doesn't want to be
against
there.
Who doesn't want to be there.
I think I know someone who taught at the Musicon and taught clarinet, and I think there's a much bigger issue because parents are often oh, you have to go do some classical instrument, and then there's just a kid that hates being there.
Yep, I was one of them. I was in the Musicon for 2 or 3 months on the trumpet. And there was just nothing for me. My heart breaks for the poor guy who had to teach me.
Yeah. I think teaching something like drums is usually not as big of an issue, but it's still a kid comes in and he's got some list of songs that he wants to learn, and he just can't play those songs from the get-go. And then I was let me give you a couple of exercises, and if you do this, your skill will develop, and then eventually you can jam that song. And that's oftentimes not what a kid wants to hear. I don't think I was the best at teaching music.
Yeah.
I've got a friend that's very good in kind of inspiring this passion in kids for music that I just didn't have.
Yeah.
I told a friend the other day, it's with music, or especially with an instrument like drums, where it's not usually a parent pushing the kid to play the instrument. They come there with a lot of excitement. And I felt I always killed the excitement. Whereas, I've tried some math tutoring and stuff, and there's usually the case. The kids come in hating the subject. And then I feel
you're unlocking it for them now.
Yeah, you can almost improve on that hatred. It's not so bad.
Start off a low base and you can just add to that.
Yeah, where it felt like when I was teaching music, I was just, I don't know, destroying people's passion.
So I wanted to ask, would you ever go into physics lecturing, or does that academia side of the whole field appeal to you, or not really?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, I enjoy teaching in whatever capacity that would be, if it is lecturing or even teaching, kids. That is all very, very appealing to me.
I mean, I think it's important in a country like South Africa, where unfortunately the education system is not always up to scratch, that we do have educators who have a passion for their fields, so that they can literally just lift up the standards of education across the board.
Yeah, I think that's something that's often very frustrating to me, because I feel teachers are some of the most important people in our society. And oftentimes I always say this, when you talk about someone that either loves math or hate math, they've usually always got a story about a teacher.
Yeah.
It's never or they will say, yeah, I was never really good at math. But then once you ask them, they're I had this teacher, and just
This and that
hated
happened.
me or whatever. Or someone that's really passionate will also have a similar story about some teacher that inspired that in them. And so I think, teachers are so important, and it's sad to see that you have a lot of people in professions that, well, they go into it not necessarily with a passion. I've known quite a few people go into education just because they felt that they can get a bursary and they don't know what else to do.
Yeah.
Where, people that are really passionate about teaching are, I think, some of the most important people in our society.
I've got a friend who's she teaches like primary school, but like late primary school, grade 6, from what I could gather, in Switzerland. And I mean, in those countries, teaching is revered, right?
Yeah.
And I can see it from her quality of living. Like it's completely different from the way that we treat our teachers this side, both from a pay perspective, but also just the environment in which they operate.
Yeah.
I mean, something that I do think helps a lot is being in a first world country with like all of the resources on earth available to you, and like all of the taxes being thrown at, like, throw money at the problem basically. So unfortunately, that's not something that we can approach in a similar manner. But it can, in my opinion, it can be done a bit better in the South African context. We're facing a tough time with regards to. I mean, we have this massive unemployment issue, especially youth unemployment issue, along with uneducated, like a massive uneducated base, and the fact that people aren't employed means that there's no taxes in order to fund their education. So it's really a catch-22 on how you go about solving this.
Yeah.
And I like people often complain about government but I think it's a very tough position to be in to solve all of these problems that we sit with.
Yeah. No, it definitely is. And you see it with so many situations. I often think, like, people have opinions about what the right thing to do is, but how do you govern a bunch of people with different opinions about what the right thing to do is?
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah.
It especially in a place where there are so many different views and peoples, as in South Africa. I think what helps a lot in those Scandinavian countries, it's something that is the like homogeneity of the society. Like everyone is white Scandinavian people, and they all have similar values and similar cultures. So there's not that much variation within society. While over here we have just these massive varying peoples, which makes it, I think, very difficult to drive any sustainable change.
Yeah, it definitely is a very unique challenge.
Yeah, but I think if we can crack it if we can crack that in South Africa, that could be one of our greatest strengths. It could basically be something that we export to the rest of the world to a certain degree. Yeah.
Because you see even societies that are so is homogenous the word, that you see with immigration becoming more and more mixed as time goes on.
Yeah.
And you see, them experiencing challenges that historically they've never experienced, because they, don't know how do you work with different cultures, or
how do they solve this now all of a sudden?
Yeah.
Well, we've been having these challenges for like years and years and years. So if we can, I mean, we still struggle a lot, but I do think we quite advanced in our discussions, and we can have robust discussions at least about these things. While in many other places, I mean, I've spoken to people in the US where they say like it's just swept under the carpet to a much larger degree. Because I think something in South Africa that is interesting is that our demographical majority is an economic minority, if that makes sense. So it's sort of the many people have few resources, while the few people have many resources. So that forces us to have to engage with each other. While in America, the majority also holds the majority of economic resources. So it's very easy for them to just like absolutely marginalize and ignore other people's, basically.
Yeah. That's true. It's a lot harder to ignore those kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very much in your face. And
Yeah.
but I mean, I do think we touch on. I do think things. It depends on what period you're measuring over, but I do think things are improving, at least in the South African context.
Yeah. Well, I mean, worldwide, there's an interesting book I read called Enlightenment now by Steven Pinker. Don't know if you've heard of him.
I've heard of Steven Pinker, yeah.
Yeah. Very fascinating character. But in Enlightenment now, he builds this case for for progress, basically. Not that it's always going to improve. And he says we have to work at improving things. But he shows graphs historically over, going back to whenever in that thing we started collecting data.
Measuring, yeah.
And it's mind-blowing to see how wrong our intuitions of the world is. And it's also interesting to see like the world is a better place in a lot of ways than we think it is.
Yeah. People just like complaining, man. That's the big thing. Like it's an easy way to unite people. Like it's an easy conversation starter. Like the weather's shit today, or did you see the politicians are doing that again?
Yeah.
But if you look at things, as you say, like look at the data.
Yeah.
We're living in the best of times that's ever existed. I mean, it's being brought into question with this whole Russian invasion thing again. But hopefully they figure their stuff out. No,
definitely. What's interesting is another very similar book I read, a book called Factfulness, written by a guy named Hans Rosling. And I think a lot of Steven Pinker's data came from Hans Rosling. And he's passed away now, but his book was released, I think, in 2018, and was kind of like at that stage, he knew he was going to die. I think it was from cancer, and this was like his last thing he wanted to put out into the world. And he spoke to like the United Nations and at the World Bank and stuff like that.
I think I've seen a TED Talk.
I think he's got quite a few TED Talks. But he also talks about the state of the world, and he's got this quiz that he does in the beginning of the book where you just like, he asks, okay, so I don't know, what do you think the average, what's the, the lifespan worldwide? How long on average do people live? Those kinds of questions. And then it's interesting to see how wrong your intuitions are. And he says, speaking at the United Nations and the World Bank and to these massive amounts of people that literally make decisions that influence the direction that the world is heading in, he says often they are just as ignorant as what the current state of the world is. And these are the people making decisions for our futures. But the thing I wanted to bring up is in the graphs, you see certain trends. Like, for instance, I think mortality was one, like average lifespan. You see it just increasing, but there are significant events in history, then you see these dips.
Yeah.
And these dips do happen, but there's a trend. You know? I think it was the Second World War was like a big dip, obviously. And then there was a massive famine in China that put a big dent in the average lifespan of people. But, it's this upward trend.
I always tell people, like, trends are very important in your own life as well. Because we often, a friend of mine actually shared this picture, and it's a very simple one, and it shows your growth over, let's say, days, and then it's sort of all over the place. I mean, it's up, down, all over the place, right? I mean, you have a terrible day, a good day. It's just crazy. And then over months, and then you sort of see a slight upward trend, but it's still like quite variable. And then if you look at that over decades of your life, I mean, if you sit now and you think where you were last week, you might think, oh wow, like this was a horrible week. Like things went terribly for me. But when you look at your life and you think, where was I 5 or 10 years ago? That tends to be an upward trajectory, and it tends to be the case for the world as well.
What's also interesting about that is Steven Pinker talks about this effect where our emotions when it comes to bad news are a lot more intense than good news.
So it sticks more.
It sticks more and you remember it more.
That makes sense.
So there's this thing about, he says like a tsunami happening and killing thousands of people, that's a big news event. No one ever reports like, over the last 20 years, we saw this positive trend in whatever.
Yeah.
The trends never get reported.
The good news trends never get reported.
Exactly.
Yeah. People like bad news. That's an unfortunate.
Yeah.
But I think to that extent, there are a lot of people like Steven Pinker, and there's another. I'm reading a book. Or it's actually not a book that you read. It's more a book that you just. It's got visual representations of all of these improvements, but just like in pretty graphs, basically, or like funky ways to represent the data.
Yeah.
And I find it very appealing because that ties in very closely with my job as well.
Mm.
And it's cool to see that there are people trying to drive this, the change in thinking.
Mm.
But I do think we can do more on like grassroots level as well.
Yeah.
Like start on our place. And when you hear your neighbor complaining about something, tell them like, actually, what you're saying is not completely true. Like things have actually been going better. Or if you think about it in this way, it doesn't help to just get bogged down in the negative side of things.
Definitely.
We can each drive really a lot of change from our sides. Thanks a lot for coming in the conversation, VP. That was very interesting, and like you blew my mind on many things. I think that's probably why I feel a bit out of it at the moment. It's a lot to process, and I mean it's cool to talk to you and to really see that this is someone who's doing what they want to do. Mm-hmm. Like it's not something where you've been nudged by any external forces into this. Because as you said, there is a bit of an ego thing to be able to be called an astrophysicist.
Yeah.
But it's really not the case for you. I can tell it's something that you're just really interested in. You just want that knowledge. And that's really cool to see.
No, thanks.
Yeah.
And obviously, currently, as I say, I'm not an astrophysicist at all. I think I'm a couple of years away from being called that.
I mean, that just speaks to your humbleness again.
Yeah.
I mean, I think... you're selling yourself a bit short here from the conversation that we just had. You have a very, very good understanding of these things. And it was very nice to talk to you and to pick your brain on them.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure, thanks.